core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her beliefs. In an anarcho-capitalist society, like, you play Monopoly long enough, one person ends up with all the money. We had something similar happen with relationships, where we have an increasingly deregulated dating marketplace. And now with the introduction of apps, men being how they are reluctant to settle down when they have lots of options.
How do we promote, what do we do to promote marriage?
I wondered if we could pay people to get married. If we had the marital matrimony fellowship, I think this would incentivize people. I'm not talking about enforced marriage or some kind of arranged marriage, but just find a partner. And if you find someone you like and you get married, you're going to get $100,000 deposited into your account.
Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Rob Henderson. Rob is the author of the best-selling book Troubled, which was the best book I read in 2024. He's currently a columnist for the Free Press and also the Boston Globe. Rob, welcome to World of Des.
Hey, Auren. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Really excited. Now, there's this Mark Andreessen quote that says something like, CEOs are not actually concerned with profit. They're concerned with being seen as good people. Unpack that for a bit. What does that say about status in the tech world?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of people have this misconception that, money is the prime mover of the world. We have these phrases like, money is the root of all evil. Money makes the world go around. Follow the money. And often, that's a pretty good heuristic often to use, that, profit is a motive for a lot of people, sort of financial profit and incentives. But that Andreessen quote, I think, highlights something that I've been concentrating on for a long time, which is also the importance of social status, of the esteem in which we're held by the people whose opinions we respect.
And in some ways, that is why people make money in general. You don't make money for money. You often make money to convert it into status, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, they care more about what other people think about them than how much, the number on their bank account. There was a really interesting study a couple of years ago, which found that sociometric status is a stronger predictor of well-being than socioeconomic status. And sociometric status in particular is essentially respect and admiration from your peers. People who are well-liked and admired by the people around them, by their social circle, are happier than people who make lots of money. And I think that's what that Andreessen quote captures. Yeah.
And when we talk about elites, what how do we define that? What is an elite?
Yeah,
are there more elites today than there were in the past, or are there fewer?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Peter Turchin, his idea of intra-elite conflict and, how that sort of cultivates political instability. I mean, he says that there are more elites now. And whenever sort of cyclically throughout history, whenever there are too many elites or elite aspirants, this can give rise to instability in societies. And he points out that, if you define elite by, say, the number of people who earn at least $10 million a year or something like that, then there are more elites now. And, he's adjusting for inflation, of course, but he points out that, if you compare the 1980s to today, adjusting for inflation, there are more millionaires in America than there have ever been. Yeah. But one thing that I try to point out in my book and in some of my writings is that, there's more to class than money alone. There's a really great book that came out decades ago by this author, Paul Fussell, called Class, A Guide Through the American Status System. And he points out that really there are three particular ingredients of class. So obviously there's money. You have to have a certain amount of wealth to be to sort of rise and achieve upward mobility, or to be sort of accepted in higher social circles. But money alone isn't enough, because if you win the lottery, it's not as if, oh, now you're the elite.
Beverly Hillbillies back in the day.
Yeah. And so overnight you don't join the elite. And then the second component is education. Did you receive an education at certain institutions, kind of exclusive institutions? And then finally, the third ingredient is cultural capital, or habitus. Your tastes, your opinions, how refined and cultivated your manners are. Do you fit in with this group?
But is 100% of people who go to Yale in the elite, or is it 20% or something like?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, there's one way that sociologists measure social class is not your particular level of education as an individual, but your parents' level of education, and that your parents' level of education is a stronger predictor of your political views and how you think about the world and your tastes and your habits and your interests more than your own level of education. And so, Ivy League institutions, something like 80% of the students there are continuing generation students, meaning they had at least one parent who graduated from college. And they've made efforts. I mean, 20% of the students now are first generation students at a lot of these institutions. And so I think under that sort of classic definition of social class, though, that 20%, they are not members of the elite. Their children might be. When
Yeah.
I have kids, maybe someday they'll join the American
But
elite, but
they
the
might not
upper
be when they graduate, but 10, 20 years after, there's a high likelihood they'll join the elite,
clan.
right? Or no?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, again, it depends on how you define elite, because there are always these fuzzy boundaries with social
Yeah.
categories. But the thing is, so even if you track those students, those first generation students who went to Yale, and compare them with continuing generation students who went to Yale, and you track them over the course of their careers, those first generation students will always lag slightly behind in terms of their income, their earnings, occupational
Yep.
prestige, how quickly they get promoted, simply because they aren't as well equipped with all of the knowledge and all of the kind of exclusive access to information and the right social circles. I mean, I had friends who were first generation students at Yale who, for example, really wanted to get a finance internship. They wanted to work at JP Morgan or one of these places, but they didn't know, when the deadlines were to apply and who to ask for
Yep.
and how to prepare for interviews. And so on paper, their resumes looked the same as their peers, but they just didn't have the requisite information to rise in those kinds of organizations the way that the peers did.
Remember that like Varsity Blues scandal where people were paying to get their kids? And it was really interesting. I thought it was interesting. So they were like, let's say their kid was getting into like the number 30 school in the ranked school. They weren't going like a terrible school usually. They're going, let's say, the number 30 school. And then they would pay like $100 million or $20 million or something like that, or $5 million to get them to go from the number 30 school to the number 20 school or something. Like it always was interesting. Like and obviously like these are people already in the elite if they could afford that much money. They were already their kids are already going to be fine. Like they're already going to at least a number 30 school. Plus, like their parents all had over $100 million. Like it's like you can't cry for these kids. Like what's going on in their mind? Like why are they breaking the law and doing all these crazy things just to go up like 10 spots on the U.S. News and World Report ranking?
Yeah, well, I think it goes to your point earlier about how people will pay money in exchange for status, right? Like if money
And
was the only thing that
is that
mattered,
status is like because you were saying before the status conferred about your parents. I think for so many
mm,
parents, the status is almost conferred about how good their kid is doing. It like goes the other
oh
way.
yes, yeah. There's this kind of cyclical. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I think that's what it is. Where because a lot of these Hollywood stars, they probably they may be treated as kind of Hollywood royalty, but if they wanted to get their kids onto a certain kind of ladder among the ruling class or something, then it helps to go to an elite university,
But
and so
these
they
weren't
were
just
willing to shell
Hollywood.
out all
Like
this money.
a lot of those people, Varsity Blues, were like the number 2 or 3 guy at TPG, which is one of the
Yeah,
biggest private equity funds. There were like
yeah.
serious people who were doing this
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah, well, I remember there was a friend of mine who he's a college professor, and he posted on Twitter something like, so he went to Yale and he was thinking, okay, am I going to pay money to send my daughter to Yale? And he was doing the math, the back of the envelope math of, okay, well, I'm paying X amount for tuition, X amount for living stipend, this, that, and the other to get her there. Or I could put this into some kind of trust, and when she's whatever 35, she'll have some X number of millions of dollars. So is it worth it to pay, half a million to send her to Yale now, or wait 15 years and she'll have, several $1 million without the degree? And the comments were like, oh, but there are all these intangible benefits to going to a place like Yale, the circles, the
Mm.
privilege, the access, the kind of career ladders you're able to climb. What it does for, basically opens up all these doors for you that money alone can't open. And I think there is, that's probably going on a lot of people's minds when they're, willing to literally break the law to send their kids to these institutions, and paying professional test takers to take the SAT for their kids and that kind of thing. It was just, yeah, that was a crazy scandal.
Now you originated the term luxury beliefs for our listeners who don't know what that is. Can you just like kind of quickly summarize it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I coined this term luxury beliefs, which are ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the less fortunate members of society. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her beliefs. And there are different kinds of sociological frameworks that I introduced to explain the idea. But you can trace it back to 1899, this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. And Veblen, who was an economist, he pointed out that, in his day, elites would exhibit their status with luxury goods, expensive and delicate and restrictive clothing, tuxedos and evening gowns and those kinds of things, top hats and pocket watches. And
Mhm.
then if you fast forward to the mid 20th century, Pierre Bourdieu and other sociologists pointed out that elites would often convert their economic capital into cultural capital, which is kind of what you and I have been discussing, where wealthy people would take their money and then convert it into access to exclusive educational institutions and social circles, learning intricate and arcane knowledge about wine and art and exotic locations. And basically expressing this kind of knowledge meant that you were raised in an upper class family, and that you had access to, the right kinds of institutions and social circles and whatever. But if you fast forward to the present, my claim is that luxury beliefs are the latest expression of cultural capital. And there are specific examples we can get into, but, in example after example of a luxury belief, and I dig up survey data and statistics and so on, where you find that often the highest income Americans are most likely to espouse certain beliefs and opinions and support certain movements, while ordinary Americans and lower income Americans are the least in favor of these kinds of luxury beliefs, in part because they are the ones who are going to be the most likely to bear the brunt of when those beliefs are implemented into policy or into culture.
And you had a couple examples, letters like defund the
Yeah.
police, or maybe like not promoting marriage, or other types
Yeah.
of things like that.
Yeah.
Um, are there, and most of those beliefs would be like, let's say somebody on the left more likely believing them on,
Mm,
if the rich person on the left. Are there are
mm.
there kind of like luxury beliefs that are more on the right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are. And it's interesting. Like when I left the military when I was 25 and I stepped foot on the campus of Yale in 2015, at that time, there was this strange reconfiguration of our politics where, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that in 2012, wealthy people generally tilted toward Romney over Obama. But then over the last, decade or so, there's been this shift in our politics where more and more high income people are voting for Democrats, whereas more working class people are tilting toward the Republican side. And so by the time I, had access to elite institutions, I saw this, reconfiguration. So it's possible that, had I entered Yale 15 or 20 years ago, my examples of luxury beliefs would be very different. But it just so happens that, a lot of the beliefs tend to be sort of more left coded. I suppose you mentioned defund the police, this belief that it's not important for children to be raised by two married parents. And there are, I think, even now, these more kind of right-coded, conservative luxury beliefs. Trickle-down economics would be one example. This belief that if you just let, very high-income people keep all of their money, that somehow those benefits will redound to the benefit of other people. Another example, and I know that, like, Silicon Valley, there's, I think, generally people who work in tech tilt Democrat, but we're seeing more and more of them support the Republican side. And the view that you can profit from selling lots of addictive technology to the masses, but then privately exercise very careful control over how you and your family use screens and devices and digital technology at
Yeah,
home.
that's a
And
common
you see a
one.
lot of them.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that's
Mm.
interesting. Now, tech has gone through at least some sort of ideological vibe shift.
Yeah.
I think even just like a decade ago, I think Peter Thiel and David Sachs, which are both previous Roll Das guests, they apologized for writing the diversity myth, which they wrote when they were in college, and then more recently, they've apologized for apologizing. Like,
Mm.
how can you like break down this transition?
Mm.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please sign up for our newsletter. Go to worldofdas.com. The link is in the description below. Now back to the video.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, I think people are likely to respond to kind of political and ideological shifts with time. I mean, we saw this with Zuckerberg, right? After the 2016
Yep.
election, Zuckerberg apologized for his policies and how he was handling Facebook, and promised to identify misinformation and fake news and so on. And then more recently, he's been more favorable to Donald Trump in 2024, and now he's sort of shifting his attention away from misinformation and adopting that kind of community notes approach that Elon Musk took with X. And I think that, if you're, there, economic elites often will respond to the political moment in order to form stronger alliances with whoever has power among the political elite. And so I think that's kind of what's happening now, where, now that we have a new administration and there's mentioned the vibe shift, that, it may be wise to not, not piss off the existing administration too much, especially because I think the general belief and the general feeling, I think, of Trump the second time around is very different than the first time. I think the first time it was seen as a fluke and that we're just going to sort of get through these 4 years and that was a blip in history and we'll get back on track. But now that he's been reelected, I think people recognize that this is a political movement that has some staying power, and it may be wise to, not support these politically correct woke movements as much anymore.
Now, a lot of people say like wokeness has peaked. Has luxury beliefs peaked?
I think wokeness generally has peaked. I don't think it's peaked in academia. I have friends who are still academics, and they tell me horror stories that it's as bad as ever. But generally in the culture,
and
I think
why do you think it hasn't? Yeah. Why do you think it's peaked in society, but that hasn't trickled down to academia?
Yeah. Well, academia just attracts a very certain type of person, and they're driven, I think, often by ideology. I think, unlike journalism, like you probably saw recently, like Jeff Bezos announced, the opinion pages of the Washington Post are going to shift to a more sort of pro-liberty, pro-free markets stance. And even journalism, which attracts a similar type of personality to academia, there's still a bottom line with journalism, right? You either have subscribers and you're making a profit or you aren't. Whereas in academia, there's no concern with profit. It really is this kind of, it's built on reputation. It's built on these kind of citation rings. It's built on, do you get invited to the right conferences? Do you get your papers published in the right places? And so it's very different there. And people are just as vehement and ideologically driven as ever. But I don't think luxury beliefs have peaked. I think maybe the specific beliefs, the specific examples may change over time. Like defund the police, for example, that peaked maybe 4.5 years ago.
It was a fad. It was more of a fad belief in a way.
Yeah. Well, I compare the luxury beliefs idea. I draw this parallel to fashion, where the idea of fashion will always be with us. What's fashionable? What's trendy? What's in style? That will be with us, but the specific, clothing will change from season to season and year to year. It almost
has to be for luxury beliefs, because if it gets too popular, then you can't signal your class anymore, and so you have to move on to something else, right?
Yeah. I mean, like wokeness itself, you can trace that as a kind of luxury belief. Where I remember the mid 2010s on elite college campuses, where the word woke was considered cool. Like people would say like "stay woke," as in like this is a cool term. We're all kind of in this clique. Let's stay woke. And then, fast forward 5, 6, 7 years later, and you have Sean Hannity on Fox News railing against the woke. It's like, oh, that term isn't cool anymore. Now, the boomers know about it. Now the uncool people are talking about wokeness. So then the line became wokeness doesn't exist, or what's woke, or I don't even know what you're talking about. And they move on to something else.
Now, 3 of my favorite books are your book, Troubled, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, and The Other Wes Moore by Wes Moore. And they all kind of tell almost a very similar story of someone kind of picking themselves up and learning over time and overcoming obstacles. It's almost like a truly American story. Like, why does this resonate so much in America?
Yeah, we have this, Horatio Alger, rags to riches, Great Gatsby mythology. I just wrote this essay about F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think it'll be in the Free Press soon. And, we have this, this longing for those kinds of stories in fiction and in nonfiction, of someone who starts from humble beginnings and just through, a lot of effort and, if you're fortunate enough to be blessed with some talent and a lot of luck and assistance along the way, that, we can achieve something and become greater than what we were. And I think like a lot of people, especially, the American dream is, maybe you yourself can improve your life circumstances, or if you work really hard, your children can do better than you. And one thing I've noticed with readers of my book, a lot of the older readers who had similar circumstances to me, but they didn't have that sort of upward trajectory. Their lives started out not so great and never really got better, but they're doing everything they can to help their own kids to achieve a better life than they had. And,
Yep.
they read books like mine or books like Wes Moore's or J.D. Vance's in order to learn the lessons and sort of remind themselves of the kinds of mistakes and pitfalls that you can experience when you're in those circumstances, and then to help their children avoid them.
One of the things is that there's kind of like two types of stories, both in fiction and in nonfiction, that people gravitate to. One is the story, like the troubled story, where you have someone who really comes from nothing and but like legitimately comes from nothing and then kind of makes it. The second one is almost this other story of somebody who, like, they were born into royalty, but then by dint of their circumstance, they're poor,
Mm,
and then but they have these like famous parents somehow or something. And then they,
mm,
kind of like the Cinderella story or the Luke Skywalker story, or, they actually were
mm,
born with these powers, these magical powers that happened or something like that.
mm,
And they just had to, like, someone else help them realize it. And to me, the
mm.
former one is so much more appealing than the latter, because it just seems, because most of us aren't born with anything. We don't have like we're not like a secret prince or
Yeah.
princess or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny, like that trope of, like, the child who's born in seemingly humble beginnings, but then you discover that they have these, they're born, they're like Superman or something. They have these superpowered
Yeah.
parents on Krypton. That's not that's not the reality. I point out in my book that real life isn't a fairy tale. It's not a comic book. But somehow, yeah, that's appealing to us. Where, I wrote this Substack post a while ago. I use the Captain America movies as an example, where you have this scrawny kid, and then he just meets this magical scientist who injects him with this super soldier serum, and now he's this big buff superhero. And I'm like, that's not how reality works. And not only did he get injected with the serum and he's super strong, but then he suddenly knows expert level hand to hand combat and combat arms training, and he knows how to use every weapon. And that's just
Yeah.
not the reality. And you never see him like sitting around, like reading the U.S. Army Field Manual or reading Clausewitz or Sun Tzu or anything. He just like knows everything about war
Right.
and
Like the
combat.
Matrix
And
is like
yeah,
that too. Like all of a
yeah,
sudden it's like, what, this is so silly. It's like he
yeah,
didn't even
yeah,
do that. He played a video game for
yeah.
like 3 hours and now he's like expert level fighter.
And it's not, yeah, the reality is, like, obviously, if you want to achieve something, you have to have some base level of raw ingredients and talent and ability, but it just takes endless amounts of hours to cultivate that and to bring that out in someone. But even if you have a really bright little kid, if they're not stimulated in the right way, if they don't have role models and access to resources and those kinds of things, that ability is never going to express itself. And I talk in Troubled about how at one point in one of the foster homes, I never learned how to read. And so, they sent this psychologist to administer this IQ test, and I scored way below average on the verbal section. And it wasn't because I was dumb. It was just because no one read to me and there were no books around and I was
Yeah.
changing schools all the time. And so I think, like, that's like the fantasy is one thing, but the reality, even if you have a kid with talent, it's very different. It still requires a lot of effort and hard work.
Now, there's so many kids who have either one parent who's just completely overworked, or they don't even have parents that are with them on a regular basis. Like, how should we? What can society do better for these kids?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a few different things. I mean, one that comes immediately to mind, since we've been talking about spotting talent, would be I think there was this movement against standardized testing, which was another luxury belief that I that I could riff about. But I think that every high school should essentially make standardized testing, SAT or ACT, mandatory and free. I remember in high school, I never took the SAT because I learned that there was a testing fee, and we didn't have much money when I was growing up, and so I didn't want to bother with the financial aspect of it. And then, like, now I know that there are waivers and fee reductions and all these things for low income families, but the funny thing is, like, that information is like the least available to those very families, like how college works,
Totally.
how to
Yeah.
apply, and all those kinds. So I just think, like, let's just make it free. and make every kid take it. And that's like a quick way, I think, to spot gifted young
Or low
people who
income
are,
schools with low income, they could just
yeah,
pay for it, through the school
yeah,
or
exactly.
something or whatever.
There was a study out of the Chicago school system where they identified a lot more gifted kids once they started requiring kids to take standardized tests. And before this implementation of the test,
So,
gifted
but
students were identified through,
don't
yeah,
all schools in all states have some sort of standardized test that even like second graders take and stuff like,
probably, yeah. But I think, like, yeah, something
but
like,
they don't use
well,
it.
yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, and then I think they should administer something like the SAT to identify these kids and get them on track. But then the other thing I think is to concentrate more on, family and what's really important for kids, and supporting the emotional stability and security of young people. And that's one thing I try to point out in Troubled is, that even if you have kids who grew up like I did, whether in, poor or dysfunctional or unstable situations, foster homes or what have you, even if every single one of those kids goes off to college and earns a comfortable, middle class living, they're still carrying all of those really difficult experiences with them. And ideally, we want to get to a place where fewer kids have to experience that in the first place. So I think we have to, people who have a lot of political or economic or social influence could do more to prize and prioritize things like marriage, things like, supporting young families, supporting kids, and, ensuring that people are putting the needs of young people first to help them to be sort of emotionally secure and stable. And even if we focus only on that, more kids as a byproduct would end up going to college and achieving upward mobility anyway. Melissa Carney in her book, The Two-Parent Privilege, she points out that the number one predictor of graduating from college is being raised by two married parents. I mean, that outperforms everything: socioeconomic
Yep.
status, whether your parents went to college, anything like that. And so, whether we're focused on what happens after the age of 18 or what is going on before, I think we should focus more on the family question too.
No, a lot of people are talking about the decline in birth rates, but at least in the US,
Mm,
married women are having like roughly the same number of children as they were 25 years ago. But unmarried women are having like way fewer children. And of course, fewer people are getting married. So there is this
yeah.
kind of like, it's both a problem, like we're having fewer kids as a society, but then at the same time, as a percentage of kids, fewer of them are born to unmarried people.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a fascinating analysis in The Economist that came out late last year, which, I think, like, especially among people who spend a lot of time on online and who's, read, legacy media and, college educated people, they are focused on their own group and they think, oh, the reason why the birth rate is declining, a lot of them think this is because, oh, women are going off to college and they're delaying child rearing. And so fewer children are being born. But actually, college educated women are having just about, not quite, but just about as many children as they've ever had. Whereas it's poor and low income women who aren't having as many children. And it's funny, a lot of people, because I've been sharing this online and people will applaud this and say, oh, that's great that, if you're poor and unmarried, maybe you shouldn't have kids and this is a good thing. But I think there's another way to think about this, which is, maybe, we should be promoting marriage, because if you're, married people tend to not be as poor as unmarried people. And I know there's this discussion about, oh, is it that wealthier people are more likely to get married, or does marriage help you to make more money? I think it's a little bit of both. There is evidence of a treatment effect of, if you get married, you are more likely to go on to have higher earnings for a lot of different reasons. And so if we promote marriage, then as a byproduct, we'll end up having more kids anyway, because most people want to get married first before they have kids. But there's been this interesting kind of generational shift where, when I was a kid, there was a period in my childhood where I lived with two teenage girls. Both of them were teen moms. They had multiple kids with multiple different fathers, didn't have a relationship with them. And now here we are, this is, 20 plus years later, those kids of those girls grew up and they're in their 20s and they don't have any kids. And, on the one hand, it's great. Like, you don't want to have kids if you're not ready for it, if you're not in a position in your life to have them. But on the other hand, if we as a society want, children being born into healthy and happy circumstances, then we should promote people to form strong, sturdy relationships with one
How
another.
do we promote? Like,
Yeah.
what do we do to promote marriage? Like, is that like what could we do to do that?
Well, I think there are different ways to do it. I think, because I thought about this, there have been successful public awareness campaigns that have changed behavior over time. Like smoking, for example, in the 1980s, about 40% of Americans smoked at least one cigarette per day. And then through sort of a concerted effort to share information and knowledge with people, that, hey, smoking's bad for you, and sharing the statistics and the data and so on. Smoking doesn't just affect you, it affects your people around you, secondhand smoke and so on. And now today, I think the number dropped from something like 40% in the 1980s to about 15% today. I think we could do something similar, some kind of public awareness campaign. Like when I was a kid in the 90s, I remember turning on the TV and it was like every third commercial was like, smoking's bad for you, smoking's bad for you. If we did like the reverse of that with marriage, which was like, marriage is good for you if you find the right partner, right? If you find the right partner, marriage is
Yeah.
good for you, marriage is good for you. And I also wondered, a lot of governments are paying people to have kids. They give people a stipend or some kind of financial incentive to have children, and it's been met with very limited success, with the exception, I think, of countries like Hungary. But generally, it hasn't been as successful as people thought it would. But I wondered if we could instead pay people to get married. Essentially, like, we've been talking about status. If we could like attach it to some kind of status thing, like people do this with like grants, for example. But if we had like the marital matrimony fellowship, and if you're a recipient of this, you get money, you get status, maybe you get featured in some magazine or something, and so now you get the money, you're now a named fellow, and you find a partner. And I think this would incentivize people. I'm not talking about like enforced marriage or some kind of
Yeah.
arranged marriage, but just find a partner. And if you find someone you like and you get married, you're going to get $100,000 deposited into your account, and you'll be a fellow of whatever. And I wondered if that might be more effective, because you get the financial incentive and the status increase.
Because I mean, in marriages in general, we're seeing, at least in the U.S., the rate of marriage has gone down dramatically, but the rate of divorce has also gone down dramatically. So the people who
Yeah.
are getting married are presumably happier in their marriages, and because divorce is still is even easier to get today than it was in the past. So presumably they're happier, they're staying in them longer, like they're more fulfilling, even though the marriage rates have gone down. So maybe just like the more committed people who really want to be married are getting married. And, getting divorced is not necessarily the best thing either in a child's life, or sometimes people who get divorced don't even have kids. And so, we don't want just marriage. We want marriages ideally that last at least for some period of time, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think like at a minimum, you want to, if you have kids, I think like, I guess I'm enough of a libertarian that if there are no kids involved and you enter a contract with another adult and then you want to break it, like, fine, you're both,
Yeah.
mutual agreement. But if there are kids involved, then you have to start prioritizing their needs. But then, once they leave the house, I guess like from that point, again, like it's just adults making decisions. But yeah, I think we would want, because you're right that I think the reason why divorce rates have declined is because fewer people are getting married in the first place, and the people who are getting married tend to be conscientious and a lot of self-control, willingness to
And those
commit
people
to
are also getting
something.
married later, and maybe later they're a little bit more mature. Sometimes if you get
Mm-hmm.
married when you're 21, you may be more immature, you may pick the wrong partner or other types of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, now we have this. Like everyone used to follow the very same life script, regardless of class, regardless of political orientation, money, background. That you reach a certain age, you go to college, high school, maybe college, you get married, and you have kids, and you have that family. And now marriage is just one option among many. And the sad thing is that once it became an option among many, there are, like, I talk to a lot of young people now where they tell me that they would like to find a partner. They would like to get married. Like I talk to, especially young women in particular, college educated young women are having a really tough
Yeah.
time finding a partner, and they want marriage. But it's just, now that we've removed marriage as like the default goal of dating, you don't date just to date and have fun. People used to date to find someone, settle down, and get married. And people, I think, out there are having some difficulties with,
But
these sort
when
of
you talk to these college
upheavals.
educated women, they say they want marriage, but then when you ask them like, who are you looking for? They're looking for this like narrow unicorn, almost, that's very, very hard to find, and assume that
Mm,
narrow unicorn has gazillion options. So it's almost like asking, okay, who do you want to marry? I want to only marry a supermodel or something. Okay,
Mm.
well, like good luck. And so there is something like where people have to
Mm.
they have to there is like if someone is 40 years old and they've wanted to get married for 10 years and they're not married, like there's something, it's not necessarily the market, it's something about them too, or they're choosing, right? Or no?
Yeah. No, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think we've had, this is like any kind of deregulated system, power laws tend to apply. And so, generally like the gains accrue to a small percentage of people. And this is true in like complete, like in an anarcho-capitalist society, like, you play Monopoly long enough, one person ends up with all the money. And I think we had something similar happen with relationships where we have a more like an increasingly deregulated dating marketplace. And now with the introduction of apps where, there's like this frictionless way to meet more and more people, like guys who, like you mentioned this unicorn, the guy who's really tall and really handsome and really successful. A lot of women would like to date that guy, but because so many women want to date him and because men being how they are reluctant to settle down when they have lots of options, then, this creates this frustrated, for frustrated group of large young women who are trying to find a guy. And, I think there's also this message in society about how, you shouldn't settle, you should find someone, who you
Yeah.
like, and you shouldn't go for anything less than that. And I think like there's that's at odds with reality where, whether it's a job or a partner or where you live or anything, there are always going to be these bounded constraints as far as like how great something is going to be. And you have to be realistic about yourself and your resources and your means. And then from that point, you can, I think, make a more reasonable decision instead of waiting for that, the dream job or the dream partner or the dream house or something.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk to people who are like looking to be in a relationship and you ask, okay, well, like what are your deal breakers? And they'll sometimes name like the most trivial thing. It's one thing. It's like, okay, yeah, like okay, the person comes and they're high on heroin and they beat me all the time. Okay, that seems like a legitimate deal breaker or something. And they're like, oh, they don't like the right comedy or something, or they don't like to ski or it's like people have
Just,
so many random deal breakers that are out there that just
yeah.
seem like pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, like, there's this whole discourse, and I don't know how online it is, but I will say, like, when I talk to young people in real life, social media bleeds over, and so, like, this whole red flags and giving someone the ick and all this kind of stuff, like, they don't like to ski, or they eat their food in a certain way, or their favorite
Yeah,
movie is
totally.
X, and all these or like you may have seen some of these on Twitter where it's like, oh, I saw this guy, he had these books on his bookshelf, that's a red flag, you need to get out of there. And the books are often like very inoffensive. It's like, oh, he has George Orwell
Right.
on his bookshelf, that's a red flag. Like, I
Right.
don't
You're
know,
like, really?
it's strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, Orwell's a red flag now. But I think, yeah, people need to be a bit more reasonable about this. And when I talk to especially reflective and smart young women, they're aware of this. But a lot of people, they just haven't that thought hasn't arisen in their mind, and they haven't really reasoned with it yet. That there's no perfect person. We all have flaws, we all have imperfections and shortcomings. And if you want a partner to settle with, especially as you grow older, you're going to have to make compromises along the way. And so, yeah, that's not a message though that we often hear.
Now, at the flip side, men are reporting like way higher rates of loneliness than women. Like, why is that happening?
Well, I mean, there are individual personality differences between men and women, which may explain why there's this loneliness gap where men are generally lonelier than women. Women tend to be a bit more sociable. They tend to have larger friend groups. This is an interesting finding from the Oxford psychologist Robin Dunbar, where he finds that women tend to have like a tight knit kind of group of friends, like a friend group, whereas men are more likely to have like a best friend or like one or two friends. And when women have friends, they are more likely to stay in touch with them. They'll text them, they'll call them, they'll be sort of more involved with their friends' lives. They're also tend to form deeper relationships with those friends because they're more likely to talk about personal topics, whereas men are more likely to shy away from personal topics and talk more about work or talk more about topics that don't necessarily help to like cultivate those deep relationships. And then when men
Sports
have
or
friends,
something or
yeah,
whatever.
sports, or yeah, when they hang out with their friends, they're, it's usually an activity. There's this phrase, like face to face relationships versus shoulder to shoulder
Yeah, yeah.
relationships. And guys, we tend to do shoulder to shoulder. I mean, it's interesting. Even when two guys talk to one another, they're more likely to stand at like a 45-degree angle where they'll kind of be tilted like slightly towards each other, but still facing forward, like away from each other. Whereas when a man and a
Like
woman
a
communicate with
Parisian
one another,
cafe kind of thing. Like you're kind
yeah,
of like
yeah,
looking at the sidewalk, but looking at each other. Yeah.
exactly. Whereas with men and women, like when a man talks to a woman, they are comfortable with face to face discussion. When two women talk to each other, they're comfortable with face to face discussion. But yeah, I think there are kind of personality differences, and then just differences in the way we approach our friendships. And I think just yeah, you're seeing this now with young guys where no one teaches you how to make friends too. So I think like once a lot of young people leave school, once they leave college and they enter the work world, college makes things so much easier. This is something I tell young people too, is like, there's this artificial environment where like everyone around you is the same age as you.
Yeah.
It's like easy to find a romantic partner. It's easy to find friends. It's just easy to like find your people that you're comfortable with and who have the same interests as you and are at the same stage in their life course as you. But then you enter the work world, and not only are young people like not fully equipped to like find a partner, but also friendships. A lot of people have a surprising kind of difficulty with that because there isn't a lot of guidance on either of those things.
And the women are now way overrepresented in higher education. They a lot of these colleges have 50% more women than men. UCLA, I think, is 60-40 women. Med schools are even more extreme. I think UCSF is 2-1 women. I think it's 66-33 women to men. What do you think is going to be like and obviously this is all very recent. This is all just happened in the last decade or so. What do you think are going to be like some of these second order effects of that?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, a lot of like I've talked to administrators and people who work in admissions committees at universities, and they more or less freely admit now that they practice a version of affirmative action for male applicants, where
Oh
essentially if you
yeah,
have a male
I've heard it's
applicant,
like
yeah,
in many colleges is somewhere between 100 to 200 SAT point difference between men and women.
yeah, which is like it's wild because up until I think the 1980s, men outnumbered women. For because of sexism and prejudice and so on, there were way more men in colleges, and then in the 80s it reached parity, and ever since then it's been tilting more and more towards women. But what I've also heard is that if a college campus dips below 40% male, then that college attracts fewer female applicants
Of course, yeah,
because
that's why they have to do the
women want,
affirmative action. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so because women want to meet men too, they want to go to college to get an education, but you also want to go to meet a romantic partner and to date and those kinds of things too. And so, as this goes on, because it seems like it's becoming harder to find those male applicants, and even if you give them an extra 1 or 200 points on the SAT in terms of how you treat their application, they still are having difficulties. So we may reach this point now where college itself may become less important. We probably will see sort of more mixed education marriages where women are more likely to date or to marry guys who didn't go to college but who are still successful otherwise in their careers. We're already seeing kind of these interesting experiments and disruptions in higher education, and so yeah, I just think like college as a status symbol in general probably will weaken. The signal of that degree will weaken over time. But for all probably, but like certain elite institutions, I think like the cachet will probably be there to some extent. But generally, college itself will probably become less important. And then, yeah, I wonder if as I mean, I'm hoping this will correct itself. That dating itself seems to be more increasingly difficult on college campuses because of that gender skew, with more women than men, and that there will be a way to resolve that as well.
It also a lot of people, I think men more likely than women tend to be later bloomers. Though
Mm.
certainly a lot of women are that way as well. It's kind of unfair to like judge someone when they're 17, and kind of their whole trajectory of
mm,
their life is judged by a few things that they do when they're 17, where a lot of times
mm,
people are still maturing then. I meet a lot of people who, when they were 17, they were just in completely backward situations, and they,
mm.
and even when you read your book at 17, you never would have predicted your success, right? But even not
Yeah.
even that extreme, like may have good parents, they may have other types of things when they're 17, but they're just not ready, and they go work at the local fast food place, and then just by dint of just their own curiosity, they later start reading. They weren't academic in high school or middle school, but then slowly, but probably so many people are not even given the chance to go do that. Like as a society, it's so hard if you're not on that track when you're 17 to like later get on it.
Yeah, yeah, and I've had this conversation with other late bloomers too. That yeah, like you mentioned, man. I think that in particular, that was one of the things that Richard Reeves has recommended as a policy proposal about redshirting boys, like starting them in school. I think 1 year later compared to girls. So boys would start kindergarten or at 6 instead of 5 or something
Yeah.
like that, whereas girls would continue to start at 5 because girls tend to be a little bit more mature and conscientious than the boys. Um, but yeah, it's this is like a
And certainly at
surprisingly
elite
common the late
private
bloomer
schools,
thing.
that already happens quite a bit.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
if
Okay.
yes, if you have like let's say you have a July cutoff, um, you'll have you may have girls who are born July, August, September who are still in that class, but it's like the first boy who's in that class is usually November or something like that.
Hmm.
In the cutoff, and then the rest of them are kind of red shirted, and they're kind of like they'll go so they'll be like old for the other class.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Well, in my case, it was the reverse, where I was slightly young. I graduated high school when I was 17, and so that may have contributed as well to kind of my delayed development. But yeah, I think there are a lot of young guys out there who are later bloomers, and it takes them a while to find their footing, especially when you are kind of raised in the kind of circumstances that I was. If you grew up in a low income or deprived or dysfunctional environment where maybe there is some innate ability or something in you that wants to succeed, but when you're young and a little bit immature and have difficulties with impulse control and you're surrounded by temptation all around you, it's just hard to focus. But I think that one way to identify and maybe sort of accelerate success for even for late bloomers is to put them in a more stable and cultivated and rigid environment. The way that I was in the military, I didn't really recognize my own curiosity and interest in those kinds of things until I was in a place that was predictable and stable, and I had good
Hmm.
mentors and role models and people around me. And like the whole time I was in high school, or up until I was 17, really, I didn't meet, I don't think I met a single other young guy who liked to read books for pleasure. I was the only one among my friends. And I wasn't like embarrassed about it. I would read, but they thought I was a little bit of an oddball. They didn't like, it wasn't like merciless teasing or anything, but they would say, like, oh, you weirdo, you like to read. And then I get to the military and I met like smart guys in the Air Force who liked to read books and novels and fiction and nonfiction. And I'd have conversations with them, and I'm like, oh, like it just felt nice to be around other smart
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
who like to talk about ideas. And so, I think that there's got to be a way to find more of those kids and put them in environments where they can flourish.
You have like in some ways in college you have almost tale of two. You have the elite schools, the Yales, the Harvards, the Stanfords of the world. Like my guess is there's still going to be a very important signaling thing in the future, and those will still be places people want to go. But then you've got maybe another tier down, I don't know, the Villanovas of the world. Like they're
Mm,
good, they're fine schools, but they don't like confer the same type of status on
mm.
someone unless you're like a big basketball fan or something. Um, those to me seem like they're going to have way less import in the future. Do you agree or kind of disagree?
Yeah, it's so hard now, and I'm sure you've been reading a lot and hearing a lot about AI too. And I just think like predicting the future is so like I
It's
don't
so
even know.
impossible.
I can
Yeah.
see arguments on both sides. I can see on the one hand you could say, well, yeah, because education is shifting and because the signal is weakening, that people are less likely to go. But then on the other hand, I could say like because AI is taking over, and because we're going to need like some evidence of human competence in one form or another, even if it's imperfect, even if it's an inefficient way to signal that competence, such as getting a 4-year bachelor's degree, that at least it's something. And so I could also see
Yep.
the argument almost going the other way, where you want more people to go to college, because otherwise, how else are you going to stand out and differentiate yourself in a world where things are increasingly controlled by robots? So I just really don't know. I do think like generally, at least in terms of a signal for like intelligence, uh, like I remember growing up when I was a kid thinking everyone who went to college was smart. Like that was the belief, because most of the adults around me didn't go to college.
Yep.
And whether in real life or like watching TV shows, college was like, oh, smart kids go to college. You got to get A's to go to college. And now I grow up and I meet people who went to college, and I'm like, oh, like a lot of these people aren't that smart.
Right.
And
Right. I
it's
don't even know if there's a
increasingly true.
correlation. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah. It seems increasingly less. The correlation becomes weaker. So at least as a signal of intelligence, probably not, but maybe as a signal of like conscientiousness, or as a
Yep.
signal of ambition, or something else that college may
And
still have
finishing
some kind of
college is
value.
also a whole. It's not just going, but finishing is
Yeah,
and that might mean like you need some sort of stability, maybe familial stability, and other types of things to make it happen as well.
yeah, yeah. And I also
So
wonder if
there's a
there's,
class. There's a way of at least signaling your class in some way.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think like kind of like middle tier universities. Though I don't think they're gonna go away, but I do wonder about like the degree mills. These for profit predatory schools. Like I think like those, a lot of them did end up shutting down during the pandemic anyway. But I think more and more of them, they're going to attract fewer applicants.
Yeah, because in some ways, like the people would never pay for any of these things with if you didn't get the piece of paper at the end.
Yes.
Like they're not often paying for the learning. They're paying for, when I buy your book, I don't get a piece of paper saying I read the book, and I can't brag to my friends about it. I'm paying because either it's entertaining or I'm going for the knowledge or, et cetera. But when people are going to college, like the main reason they're going usually is because they want that piece of paper they can put in their resume.
Yeah. I'm sure you've come across Brian Kaplan's work on
Yes. Yeah.
the case against education, and he points out like, if you were really paying for an education, then why do students cheer when the professor cancels class? Because you're technically being deprived of a lecture that day. You're being deprived of
Right.
the education you're paying for. But really, if all that matters is that piece of paper at the end, then of course you're going to be happy that class was canceled, because
Yeah.
you get the paper without putting in the effort. And yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, I'm hoping, there may be other efficient ways of identifying promising young people without having to go through that kind of obnoxious 4-year process. I mean, there are ways to identify smart kids through testing. But then, what you mentioned before, like one of the things about a 4-year degree is like class, conscientiousness, who your family is. And, if there's a quick way to test that, it seems less clear, because part of the signal of commitment and conscientiousness and willingness to stick with something is actually having to do that for a solid 4 years. And so, but I think, well, one thing that I think helped me quite a bit when I was applying to college at a much later age was because I had been in the military. And that too is a kind of signal, right? Like you sign a contract, you serve
Yes.
it,
Yep.
you're honorably discharged, and that too kind of sends a signal. So I think like, for a lot of young guys out there, and young women too, depending on your circumstances too, for both men and women, that if you don't want to go to college right away, and you have that kind of sense of wanting to do something interesting and exciting, and there are kind of the immediate direct experiences of enlisting, but then there are the kind of indirect experiences and the kind of signaling value of having served too, that goes a long way. And those things, I think a lot of young people don't think too much about that, but in a world where increasingly fewer people are serving, it stands out, which may be another reason you pointed out, Wes Moore's book, J.D. Vance's book, and my book, that, something about the military, it does do a good job of enhancing upward mobility. And one thing that I've pointed out in the past is that a lot of colleges, they claim to be egalitarian and they claim to help with upward social mobility, but often what they really do, especially the elite universities, is recapitulate social divides. Part of the reason why these institutions exist is to stratify people by class and education and socioeconomic status. Whereas the military, it's almost the reverse, where the military is explicitly hierarchical. It's not egalitarian. They don't pay lip service to equality or anything. It's like literally a hierarchy. And if you're at the bottom of it, you get treated badly. And as you rise, you get treated better. And yet, despite the fact that it's an explicit hierarchy, it indirectly enhances upward social mobility because once you get out of the military, you're often in a much better position to enter the middle class. So there's this kind of interesting opposing function of what it explicitly is versus what it actually helps to produce in the real world.
Now, if you think of like a college degree, that still has just like a massive amount of value to people, but a master's degree, it seems like that over the last 40 years, that value has declined. And maybe even the value today is negative in many cases. Like if you just saw someone with like a master's, like a BA in history might be cool. A master's in history might be a big negative signal to a lot of folks. And fewer and fewer people are getting master's degrees. It's certainly not economically advantaged for many people to go get that. Like what's happening there?
Yeah, well, I've actually seen interesting research on this that a master's degree may actually penalize future earnings, depending on the discipline, particularly in a lot of the humanities and some of the social sciences, that it's actually, in terms of how much it costs to obtain the degree and then, what your job prospects look like after.
That time. Yeah.
Yeah, that it actually may be negative.
I mean, even MBA degrees, like outside of a small number of schools, MBA is probably a net negative for most of the people. Let's say 80% of the people who get an MBA, it's probably at this point it's probably negative, where it used to be positive for almost 100%. Right, so it's really shifted. And then even like law degrees, like, okay, maybe the top 20, 30 schools, it's positive, but it's now negative for a lot of people. So it's real. So even those more technical degrees, it seems like those degrees are less good than they once were.
Yeah, that is, well, yeah.
And maybe because they're so much more plentiful.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it'll just take time for the market to correct itself because, it's only, I would say recently, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, that there's been this growing recognition that, education is a kind of signaling arms race where if everyone has a bachelor's degree, then no one does, And so when I was a kid, high school, 15, 20 years ago now, where the belief was everyone should go to college, more education is always better. The more degrees, the better. And it's an investment in your future. And I think now people are recognizing slowly that actually, continuing to go to school, continuing to get degrees isn't necessarily the best move. And that there are other ways to more wisely and efficiently spend your time. If getting a better job is the goal. I do know some people who just enjoy, getting lots of degrees and they just like going to school.
Yeah. Most people aren't like
good
for you. Yeah. A couple of personal questions. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
A conspiracy theory that I believe. Oh man. Okay, this is going to be tough because I'm generally skeptical of conspiracy theories in general, although they do exist. I mean, it's funny, like, we have, there are cases in which they really do exist. I don't have let me see. Do I have a conspiracy theory that I believe? We've been talking about
some
education.
ways, these in some ways, like luxury beliefs is kind of a conspiracy, right?
Yeah. Although I guess the difference would be like I'm not necessarily claiming like elites all get together in a smoke-filled room and say here are the beliefs we're all going to believe.
Let's keep the masses down. Yeah.
It's kind of this weird organic situation where like very quickly for a moment it was the fashionable belief to say we need to reimagine policing and change law enforcement, and that was like the prevailing fashionable view for like 6 months, and then thank God we moved past that. And so I think like one possible conspiracy, and this is one that I guess by definition you don't necessarily have evidence, is there is this weird thing where for a while a lot of the GI Bill money for military veterans was going to for-profit schools. Like the majority of people who used their GI
The
Bill were going to
majority?
for-profit schools. The
Oh, wow.
majority of it. Yeah. And I think I've tweeted about this. If I could, I'll dig up that paper. But because it's the easiest, right? Like a lot of these for-profit
Yeah,
schools,
yeah.
it's almost the reverse. Like an elite college, the acceptance rate is like 4%, but the graduation rate is 99%. For-profit schools, it's the reverse, where the acceptance rate is 99%, but the graduation rate is 4%. And so they'll
Uh-huh.
take your money and they'll happily allow you to take all the classes and but like very few people end up graduating, in part because like a lot of these classes are online, they're unstructured, there's not a lot of accountability. And I do wonder if like there was some kind of a collaborative effort to basically say like,
Yeah.
oh, well, one way we can prop up this institution is to form a partnership with, the military tuition and with the GI Bill and with these government programs. And essentially it was a transfer directly from the government to these predatory colleges. And, one thing I try to tell veterans, because, a lot of them will ask me about, advice for college. And I would say, go to a not-for-profit college, go to your flagship state school, go to whatever school you can, but don't go
Yep.
to some weird, degree mill that's online. So that's, I'm a little conspiratorial about that one.
I believe that. That actually makes sense to me. Last question we ask all of our guests: what conventional wisdom or advice, and we've already talked about a lot of these things, do you think is generally bad advice?
Conventional advice that's bad advice, one that comes to mind is never give up. There are cases in which I think, if you really want something and you want it more than anything, then keep going. But I think a lot of people, they kind of, they mistakenly think that, well, I started it and now I got to finish it. And, you
Yeah.
could bring this down to something as small as a book. Well, I started this book, now I got to finish it. But there's always opportunity costs. And if the book you're reading sucks, just stop and read another one. There's better ways
Yeah.
to spend your time and your effort and your
Yeah. Even a
resources and attention.
movie, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. When my wife and I used to go to like theaters, we would have like us, because sometimes you don't know then like whether you really don't like the movie or something like that. And so we would have like
Mm.
a signal to one another, and we'd stay if like at least one of us wanted to stay. But if like both of us wanted to leave, and you don't want to find out after the movie, oh wow, I wanted to leave like halfway in or something, like then you should just like take out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one. And then a related one that just came to mind was, which is kind of related to how you spend your time. I think like there are cases in which time can be worth more than money. Like if you can find ways to spend money to save time, depending on your circumstances, I think that can be worth it too. I remember when I was in Airman Leadership School, I was 23 years old. So I was going through this training program to become a non-commissioned officer. And the instructor for this class was this Filipino American guy who he had served some time in prison and then got out and then was able to get a waiver to enlist and completely changed his life. And I remember I was telling him after class, like, oh, he's like, what are your plans today, Henderson? And I'm like, oh, I got to get back. I got to clean my apartment. And he was like, why are you cleaning your apartment? He's like, how much is your time worth? You got to get a cleaner, man. Like, what are you doing? And I'm like that thought never even occurred to me to have it seemed like such an outrageous, outlandish luxury to have someone clean my apartment. And I'm 23 years old, and I'm like, you think I should get a cleaner? And he was like, yeah. He's like, you could spend that time, doing other things. You could be studying for this class. You could be, preparing for your career, getting promotion, whatever you're.
Oh
And
wow,
I'm thinking to
interesting.
myself, like, wow, okay. And I'm like, at that point, I was like just in a financial position where I could do it. And so I ended up going through with it, and I've never not had a cleaner since then. So it turned out to be a great decision. And so I think that's another one is once you reach a certain point, it may be worth it to spend money to save time. But I think there's a common conventional view out there that, do everything you can to save every dollar you can. And that's not always the best choice.
This has been great. Thank you, Rob Henderson, for joining us on World of DAS. By the way, I follow you at Rob K. Henderson on X. I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. I encourage our listeners to access your Substack, which I love as well. This has been a ton of fun and super interesting.
Thank you, Auren. This has been great.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to World of DAS wherever you consume your podcasts, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and more. And please help us get discovered by leaving a review. And check out worldofdas.com. That's worldofdas.com. And of course, connect with me on Twitter at Auren. That's AUREN. Would absolutely love to hear from you.